And thank you very much, Tama, for a very wonderful presentation. Lots of very useful information compressed in a very tight presentation, and very useful insights. I learned a lot. I'm not a specialist in this issue, so it was really nice and helpful. I'm going to concentrate mostly on the issue of the information that is coming out of this model and this way to present the data that we currently have, and a little bit a final comment on the issue of introducing social weights in the estimation of the social cost of carbon. One thing that, let's say, on the first thing, on the data and all the working of the model that has been presented, I think having the spatial distribution of social impacts of climate change is absolutely crucial, and I think Tama has done a wonderful job here. I think if we look at the different categories, areas like mortality and labor productivity, we haven't seen before much on these areas. In labor productivity, we see there is very little coverage, so there is a big task ahead in terms of providing more basic information. I think mortality rates probably are easier to get in the sense that if you dig into the health and mortality data from the different countries, it's going to be a lot of work, but I think it can be produced. On labor productivity, I think you need specific studies, and that's going to be much more complicated surveys or things like that are experiments and so on. On issues more like linked to the direct physical impacts like agriculture, energy, and coastal impact, I think there is much more information. We know now much more than what we did know a few years ago. Here in Chile, the Ministry of the Environment has done a wonderful job in terms of building this ARCLIM model. It's an atlas with a very disaggregated data with physical risk of this type at the level of the different communes of the country. So it's a very important effort. The one thing that let's say, looking at the basic information for damage function estimation, I think the one missing that is very important one is that related to deforestation and change of land use. I think especially this is particularly important in the case of emerging markets. The information coming out, the latest IPCC report shows that for most of Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, most of the carbon emissions come from deforestation and change in land use. And at the same time, most of the regions are a large fraction of poor population. And in addition, these are the areas of the world where the last reserves of biodiversity remains precisely in these forests that are being destroyed. So I think there is a very big win-win situation if we can improve these damage functions here. And there is a sort of a feedback loop into climate. So in terms of calculating social cost of carbon and thinking about mitigation policies and directions of flows of money in terms of preventing climate change, I think there is a large contribution if we can improve this information. I think this is of a critical importance. So my suggestion would be to put more effort in terms of trying to go further into this information. And I think in terms of the data, it's not so difficult. I think that there is a lot of information about changing in forest cover. We have data running for 20, 30 years with satellite image. So I think we can do a relatively good job there. In terms of the computation of the social cost of carbon, I would like to say this is very important. There are things that are very important. Some of the assumptions are very critical. We have seen also in Frank's discussion this morning, the importance of discounting. This is a huge issue when so many, for this long period of time, especially when lots of these effects accumulate over time and make things that lie further into the future into higher risk, but if you discount them, then if you go beyond 50 years with 2% rates of interest, they disappear from the map. So I think the exercise is very important, the estimate of the damage functions. We need the information to identify economic damages for specific locations and social conditions. This is critical to define priorities for the allocation of resources for adaptation. I think this is a very useful input. This will also be very important for the direction of international assistance to where it is most needed. So I think this is a very crucial issue. So I commend Tama and the team for this job. I think some of the information here is also important to answer yesterday's Elias questions, the one about limits to growth, in the sense that if we want to incorporate these limits to growth into our modified traditional long-term growth models, we need to address the issue of productivity. That's the way in which this will show up in our models. And as the state of the physical world deteriorates, that will show into these damage functions, affecting mostly different types of productivity. So the way I think to incorporate this in our calculations for long-term growth, it will be to gradually increase the impacts on the estimates of productivity, different types of productivity, labor productivity, for instance, which is like suggested here because the data are really not so strong, but it's something that could be very important. But it's going to be, at the end, it's going to be TFP. It's the general productivity, the one that will be affected if nature services deteriorates a lot. And so I think that we have to work through this. We should incorporate whatever happens to productive capital and also to the natural capital into the provision of services. But the way in which this will be incorporated, it's labor, but mostly it's going to be the need for more capital intensity, especially for adaptation, and a significant decrease in total factor productivity. One last issue concerning the weight of impact climate damages according to socioeconomic variables. I think this is I think it should be very controversial. We have something, you saw these intervals, and when you get into this weighting process, you have to introduce very subjective criteria to weight. It's very difficult to have objective criteria. Let's say, if you want to weight mortality, for instance, as suggested, giving a higher value to the impact on consumption on poor people, it's in general of the damage functions. That's one way to do it, but there are many other ways to weight these variables. If you think from an economic point of view, what you would like to weight probably more are the losses of productivity due to this. And that means that probably you will weight more those workers that die prematurely that have higher productivity. Most of them won't be in the poor regions of the world. if you, let's say, probably also thinking in terms of potential output that is lost by early mortality, you probably want to give more weight to younger people who dies earlier. But on the other hand, if you are concerned about demographic impacts on the global warming, for instance, then you would probably give more weight to it would be just the opposite. So I think this is a very difficult exercise. There will be a lot of criteria. So my guess is that you will put a very controversial variable into an estimate that is already very difficult and controversial. So I think it's gonna, the political economy of using social cost of carbon will get more complicated than what it already is. If you want to think, one last issue here also, because you have to take into account that wealth and income distribution within poor regions is also very unequal. So if you want to do it rightly, you have to go into far more detail. I think if we would like to introduce some weights, again, I would try to give more weight to those damage functions that affect directly other critical environmental variables where we can have some information. For instance, biodiversity losses. If you have variables that are affecting biodiversity, I think this is a variable that is critical. It might be very difficult to put prices there, but if we see a direct link between carbon, deforestation, and biodiversity losses, it could make a lot of sense to put some additional weight to carbon emissions coming from deforestation and change in land use. We don't know how much that weight should be, but I think it should be probably be higher than 1. So it's something that I would like to suggest. And again, thank you, Tama, for a very useful and very interesting presentation. Thanks.
So, thank you very much, Joaquín. So now we have time for a few questions. So, Marshall, and we are going to take a couple of questions, and then we can go with Tama and Joaquín.
Great, thanks. I'm wearing 2 microphones, so hopefully one of them's working. Tama, this is Marshall. Excellent talk, per usual. Thanks. I had one question, and this actually follows up on a lunch and dinner time discussion we've had here about the sea level rise impacts. And I think what's puzzling, maybe is surprising in your results, is how small they are relative to the amount of sort of public or popular attention that they get. And so I wonder if you could speak more about those. You didn't talk much about them. And can you speculate on why, I guess, the estimates look so small? I know there you have to use a different machinery. It's not going to be the sort of causal econometric stuff that drives the rest of your pipeline. And so is it a difference in the machinery? Why are those, or are the effects really, you know, over the next few centuries really that small?
Yeah, great question. It's a very different machinery, as you point out, which is why I didn't try to get into too much detail. My personal opinion, not speaking on behalf of all of my co-authors, is that I definitely think they're too low. And the 2 core reasons I think that that's likely happening, and both of which are being worked on largely by Bob Kopp and other colleagues of mine. One is that the different machinery is a much more process model-based approach, where we are modeling like representative agents making optimal decisions about adaptation. And I think the built-in assumptions about rationality of adaptation and that decision-making process are quite optimistic. And so you see a lot of either migration away from the coasts or optimal defenses that are potentially unrealistic amounts of adaptation at costs that may not be reflective of true costs. So I think there's a general kind of accepting that those are probably pretty optimistic. And then the other is that storms are included in these estimates to the extent that they interact with sea level rise, but these are not estimates that currently include changes in storm activity. So if you think about all the work that you highlighted yesterday on cyclones and the enduring effect of tropical storms, and the likely increase in those tropical storms going forward, those are not currently in this sector of impacts, and that's another dimension that's likely to inflate that number.
De tierra científica.
Any other questions?
Y a su vez la cuantificación económica de la interacción de todo eso o nada.
Okay, so maybe I can ask a quick question, Tama. So I wonder how your results compare with the results for instance, from Esteban Rossi Hansberg work. So yesterday we talked about how the literature in damage functions, including geographical or spatial disaggregation, is increasing now. But of course you include adaptation, which reduces the damages, but at the same time you extend the dimensions of the damages, so that increases what we see as results. So how would you compare your work with, for instance, the result from Esteban's work, where he doesn't found so big effects?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just summarized it really well, but I think my view on where these literatures are at is that there's been a lot of exciting progress made on our end on empirical characterization of sector-specific damages in spatial and temporally heterogeneous ways. But the more that we push in that dimension, the more the questions about spatial and other forms of general equilibrium effects become very apparent, and those are not tackled appropriately or at all in some sectors a little bit, but I think we've been pushing in that direction, and that group has done some really exciting work thinking about characterizing those GE effects, and I think there's a lot to be done on trying to bring these approaches together and to see what we can learn from one another. So I think you are right in outlining the ways in which different features and bugs of each of the approaches push in different directions. And largely these have been pretty different communities of people. I think it's really exciting, I think Max pointed this out, to see a conference like this where we have a lot of macroeconomists talking about climate change. I think increasingly we are likely to see more work at that intersection that can bring some of the benefits of both approaches together to learn, where the pinpoints are on which direction we should be pushing in with those two different sets of benefits and costs. But that's not a space where those two have come together fully yet.